Now let's investigate our first cultural marker, religion, and apply it to the terms landscape and region and all of that good stuff. Here we have Notre Dame de Paris. This cathedral was built and completed in 1345. So essentially this sucker's been around for nearly 700 years. When it was built in Paris, and it was built with the objective for it to be the tallest building by far and dominate the Paris skyline. Why? Because they wanted to showcase that in terms of identity, Roman Catholicism or the Catholic Church was absolutely important in 1300 Paris, France. And so this is an example of religion, cultural landscape. We can see Roman Catholicism, this church that's it's quite old, but it was built to be so big to say, hey, this is symbolic. This is very important to the local area at that time. Here we have St. Peter's Basilica in square, although it's a circle, but whatever, in which I've already identified this is actually shaped like a key, because this is a key to heaven, and so St. Peter's is a key, important part of all of that. But when we think about the absolute core of the Roman Catholic faith, it's right here. So when we think about sacred space, when we think about cultural hearts, when we think about core areas of a particular cultural form, right here is for the Roman Catholic faith. So what this is built so people can congregate, people who practice that religion can come make a pilgrimage or come make a voyage, come visit this particular circle or square, and practice, pray. This is where Pope's funerals are held. So this is very much a common space, but a key core space, a sacred space for the Roman Catholic faith, and we can see it in terms of its layout, but also in terms of its architecture and a lot of the symbology that you see here. Here we have the backside of the Christ the Redeemer statue, which overlooks the city of Rio de Janeiro, a city in Brazil. Brazil, the largest religion is Roman Catholicism, in which 60% of the population is Roman Catholic. A lot of this owes its legacy to the Portuguese who colonized Brazil and brought with them their Roman Catholic faith via cultural diffusion. And so what we got here is kind of a couple different ways we can look at this. First off, obviously, this shows the key role of the Catholic faith. But if we notice, it's kind of been weathered away. The statue eroded. It's not as nice as it used to be. It's kind of, starting to get softer and broken down. And that's, I think, a good metaphor for also what's happening in Rio de Janeiro and Brazil. So what's happening in Brazil is, you asked this question 20, 30 years ago, how many people, what percentage of the population in Brazil is Catholic? It was close to 90%. Today, it's, in the 60% area. What's going on there is the rise of secularism. So I would argue it's kind of a metaphor for this eroding or this weathering away of the statue in the sense of the same thing with Catholic faith in Brazil. Now let's go to Israel, go to a religious hotspot here. So what I just did is I drew a circle around the city of Jerusalem. And key to understanding the conflict, a lot of the conflict in this area of the world, is the fact that you have the sacred space essentially for three different religions, two of which being universalizing religions, and another one being an ethnic religion. And so for the ethnic religion, for the Jews, this territory is referred to as, quote, the Promised Land. So it's very much the homeland for their particular ethnic religion. For the Christians, this is what they refer to as the Holy Land. And this area is where Jesus, the whole birth, death, resurrection takes place. For the Muslims, this territory, this location is what they would refer to as their third holy city behind Mecca and Medina. And this is key to this is where Muhammad, a key figure in their particular religion, ascended to heaven. We zoom into Jerusalem. This is the old part of Jerusalem, and it's essentially been divided up into these individual quarters. And that's probably for the best. Because of these areas, these individuals, these groups, all very passionate about this sacred space. They all have different views, different competitions, and so you're going to have a lot of conflict. And so what they've done over time is essentially divide up into quarters. But you could argue that this is probably the city that's had the most amount of conflict, and most of the times it's been leveled and flattened, and have had different groups coming in trying to settle and trying to claim this area more than probably any other city in the world. And it makes sense because of these religions all sharing the same sacred space. Now we'll return to our county level map of different religions, try to identify some patterns. First off, we've already identified the Mormon region, which is there in the interior west there, in Utah especially. But where we find the most common religion throughout the United States is Catholicism. Catholicism we find heavily in New England, Mid-Atlantic. You find a lot of it in the Midwest. Find it there in Florida. Also find it in the American Southwest, particularly closer to the Mexican border. So what you see there is a lot of overlap with Latin American areas, also are heavily Roman Catholic or Catholic. But then you find all throughout the West a lot of Catholicism. For the most part, the West is very diverse. Also, we're going to have higher rates of secularism. But nonetheless, we can find Catholicism, using our key terms, highest density, but also the most dispersed, or the least clustered. We look at the Southern Baptists, or the Baptists, the red area. There you see a very, very high concentration, very, very clustered area, overwhelmingly in the American Southeast. And so this is something you're going to see a little bit in Indiana, in which in the southern part of the state, you're more likely to find those red areas, or Southern Baptists. We find those orange areas, we find the Lutherans, which are clustered there in the northern part of the United States, in Minnesota and the Dakotas. You definitely see a transition. So going right through the middle of the country, left to right, let's say from New York City all the way through the Midwest, through the Great Plains. So you'll see from Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Iowa, you see a very, very diverse array of religions. We're definitely in the transition zone from the Southern Baptists to the Catholicism to the Lutherans. And so what you see is very much a blending in this particular area of the country as the different regions overlap with each other. And now we can see that very much play out in Indiana. We're all kinds of colors. So compared to other states, we don't really see clear patterns. Some of the clear patterns I do note, though, is that we see a lot of Catholics more likely to be in the northern part of the state, but also in the extreme southern part of the state. What that is Polish individuals who migrated to the northern part of the state over time, then brought with them their version of Catholicism, and then the Germans who settled in southern and central Indiana brought with them their form of the Catholic faith. Other things we note, like I said before, in the Southern Baptists, of all places are most likely to be in Indiana. It makes sense they're most likely to be found in the southern part of the state. But for the most part, the central part of the state, it kind of depends on which county you're located. But if you go to the top, you see that purple county. There's where we see the Mennonite/Amish being the most dominant type of religion there. And that's going to play a huge role in understanding later on in the semester, later on in the text, when we look at the higher birth rates there that are found in that particular county. But no matter what, one thing you'll note, especially as you go throughout much of Indiana, particularly in the rural areas, you'll see a lot of churches like this. So it really speaks to when the people that settled these areas, what was the most important thing at the time? Was the church, was their particular faith. And so then they built this, they built the most, architecturally dynamic, best looking buildings. The ones that are often the tallest buildings in a particular community were the churches. And this all speaks to the fact that these place a huge prominence. So we look at the cultural landscape of Indiana. A lot of those old churches, especially in older towns, that are very, very well built, like this church here that's found in the middle of nowhere north of Fort Wayne. This is an example of this the cultural landscape of being able to read this. You can see how this being an older building, how it speaks to a certain time period in those that settled and lived in this particular area in that time frame, how much importance the Catholic or a particular faith mattered to them at the time.